Hi friends, welcome to our channel, The Dental Educators. Today we will be discussing about the basic development of the tongue so that we have a basic concept how the tongue is being developed, which structures are involved, which pharyngeal arches are involved, because that is the main confusion to understand how the tongue is basically developing and which nerves are innervating the mucosa of the tongue, how come these nerves are innervating. So we will be going through all of these structures in this lecture today. What do we see? The tongue starts to develop at the fourth week of gestation. That means the fourth week of embryonic life. So, what happens initially? We have four pharyngeal arches. The first four pharyngeal arches, which are basically involved in the development of the tongue. Okay, so we have the pharyngeal arch on the left hand side and on the right hand side. Okay, both of the pharyngeal arches have two components, the left and the right one. So one half, the one left half merges with the right half in the midline, okay, to form up a continuous pharyngeal arch. Okay, so the first pharyngeal arch on the left hand side meets with the first pharyngeal arch of the right hand side to make up a complete first arch. Similarly, what happens, the second pharyngeal arch of the left hand side merges with the second pharyngeal arch of the right hand side to make up a continuous second pharyngeal arch. Okay, it happens same for the third and the fourth one. So you can see we have four complete pharyngeal arches. Okay, if we talk about the number of pharyngeal arches, we basically have six pharyngeal arches. Okay, but the first four are giving rise to different kind of structures. The fifth and the sixth pharyngeal arch is considered as a transient pharyngeal arch because they don't give rise to any kind of the structures in the body. So how does the tongue start to develop? First we see a swelling known as tuberculum impar that appears in the middle of the pharyngeal arch of the first pharyngeal arch. In the center or in the midline of the first pharyngeal arch, you can see this is the left half, this is the right half of the first pharyngeal arch. So it appears in the middle of the first pharyngeal arch. It is now flanked or overgrown by two other lingual swellings. So you can see this is one lingual swelling coming from the left half. This is another lingual swelling coming from the right half. So flanked itself means that it is overgrown by other two bulges. So in total we can see we have two lingual swelling and the one swelling, that is the tuberculum impar, which grows from the midline, involved in the formation of the anterior portion of the tongue. Now the two lingual swellings and the tuberculum impar, they quickly fuse with each other to form up the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. Okay, so basically you can see here a small area. This orangish colored line or the orangish colored area is representing the swelling of tuberculum impar, and rest of the pinkish area is basically representing the lingual swelling which have fused together to form up the basic region or the main region, anterior two-third of the tongue. This anterior two-third is the region which you see in the oral cavity when you open your mouth easily in the front of the mirror. Now, how does the rest of the tongue develops? This brown portion which we see here and the posterior region. Now the rest of the three pharyngeal arches are basically involved in the development of the rest of the tongue. So this second, third and the fourth pharyngeal arch are basically involved in the development of the posterior one-third of the tongue. So anterior two-third basically developed by the first pharyngeal arch, whereas the posterior one-third will develop from the second, third and fourth pharyngeal arch. Now how do they, what happens initially? A first swelling known as copula, which is associated with the second pharyngeal arch, it appears first. But that is a very small transient swelling, so that is not visible in the images which we see here. You can see no copula is represented or present in the image which we are looking here at the moment. So later on, a large swelling known as hypobrachial eminence. You can see this swelling. This overgrows over the copula. This hypobrachial eminence mainly originates from the third pharyngeal arch and partially involves the fourth pharyngeal arch as well. Just a small area of fourth pharyngeal arch is involved, but majorly the third pharyngeal arch is involved to give rise of this swelling known as the hypobrachial eminence. So what does happen? The hypobrachial eminence overgrows the small transient swelling known as the copula, which is not a prominent swelling. So majorly we can say that the third pharyngeal arch is basically involved majorly for the formation of the posterior one-third of the tongue, whereas a small area of fourth pharyngeal arch and partially second pharyngeal arch is involved in formation of the posterior one-third of the tongue. So majorly the large swelling hypobrachial eminence is involved for the formation of the posterior one-third of the tongue, in addition to the small swelling known as the copula, which originates from the second pharyngeal arch. So these two swellings, copula and the hypobrachial eminence, helps in the formation of the posterior one-third of the tongue. So you can see anterior two-third basically formed by the lingual swelling. The pinkish color represents the lingual swelling portion, and this midline orangish color portion basically represents the tuberculum impar, whereas the posterior one-third of the tongue is majorly formed by the hypobrachial eminence and a very small copula as well, but that is not making much contribution. The posterior part of the fourth pharyngeal arch marks the development of the epiglottis. Okay, so we know that just behind the tongue we have a transient structure which is related to the respiratory system known as the epiglottis. Okay, that is originated or comes from the fourth pharyngeal arch. Now, the basic concept we discuss about the anterior one-third and posterior, anterior two-third and the posterior one-third is that the mucosa of anterior two-third of the tongue originates from the first pharyngeal arch, whereas the mucosa of posterior one-third of the tongue originates from the second, third, and the fourth pharyngeal arch. But the muscles of the tongue originate from a structure known as the occipital somite. We didn't discuss about the occipital somites in this lecture. This is more related to the basic embryology, the development of the embryo. But we are just going to be specific with that the structure known as the occipital somite is basically involved in formation of the muscles of the tongue, major muscles of the tongue. And the motor nerve supply to all of the muscles is basically coming from the 12th cranial nerve, that is the hypoglossal nerve. Now finally, coming on to the nerve supply of the tongue, the mucosa of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue is basically derived from the first pharyngeal arch. So any structure which is derived from the first pharyngeal arch is supplied by the fifth cranial nerve known as the trigeminal nerve. Whereas as we discussed earlier, the posterior one-third of the tongue is basically made by the third pharyngeal arch. Majorly, the third pharyngeal arch is involved, which gives orientation to the hypobrachial eminence, whereas partially fourth and a small amount of the second pharyngeal arch is also involved. But as majorly the third pharyngeal arch is involved, therefore the posterior one-third mucosa of the tongue is supplied by the ninth cranial nerve known as the glossopharyngeal nerve. So keep in mind any structure or which is derived from the third pharyngeal arch that will be also supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve. Finally, as we discussed earlier, all the muscles of the tongue, that is the motor nerve supply to the tongue, is through the hypoglossal nerve, that is the 12th cranial nerve. So here you can see the posterior region of the fourth pharyngeal arch is basically helping in the formation of the epiglottis. The blue colored line represents the fourth pharyngeal arch. If you see here, okay, it represents the formation of the epiglottis. So anterior two-third, now coming back to that, is formed by the first pharyngeal arch, in which two lingual swellings and one swelling in the center known as tuberculum impar is involved, whereas the posterior one-third of the tongue is formed by second, third, and fourth pharyngeal arch. A large swelling known as the hypobrachial eminence is basically involved in the formation of the Posterior one third of the tongue, in addition to a small transient swelling which we discussed earlier, copula. So that was the summary about the development of the tongue. If you have any questions, you can put it down in the comment box below and let me know any further suggestions which you want me to work over it. Okay, good luck with the next lecture. See you then. Bye.